As I begin a series for Advent, hey, can you pull me down just a touch? Thank you. As we begin our series for Advent, I called it Socks and Underwear. Does anybody want to guess why that is? Because that's what I get for Christmas. Each and every year, I know that two of the packages I open, one will be socks and one will be underwear. Now, when you come up with that for a title for your series, there are lots of things that you can think about doing. I thought at first it would be a marvelous idea to decorate that tree right there with individual socks of mine and underwear. And then I thought, no, we need a bigger tree. So I thought on the front of your bulletin, I had simply snap a photo of my underwear. No, okay, there's all sorts of ridiculous stuff that came to mind, and believe me, I thought about having fun in all those ways, and I'm not gonna. That's my promise to you right now. So I want you to take a deep breath and go, for all the stupid stuff our pastor sometimes does, thank goodness he didn't do that. But socks and underwear, I do receive those each year, and it's one of those that I don't think there's a child alive, and if I'm wrong, please feel free to let me know. I don't think there's a child or adult alive that goes, yeah, whatever, newest electronic device, great, this will be a fun toy, where are the socks? Yeah! I've never seen anyone open socks or underwear and just come apart, maybe tears of joy. But that's the thing. Socks and underwear are something that, as far as I'm aware, everybody needs. Everybody needs them. And I appreciate that I get those every year. And we, in turn, give our children socks and underwear also because I know that they need them. And that's what this sermon series is going to be. It's going to be like socks and underwear. Again, anything stupid, put it aside. No worries. Socks and underwear in the sense that this may not be big, and it may not be flashy, and it may not be a series that you go, oh, it's so clever. But what I hope to bring are some things that everybody needs. What I hope to do as I share with you through this series and as Nathan shares with you, I bring some things that really you need and you're grateful for in the end. And this morning, as we start the series, I just wanted to ask, do you know what it's like to wait for something? I mean, maybe you still have that giddiness in you, or maybe some of the youth here, you still have that, like you cannot wait until Christmas morning and you see all the gifts and you look for the socks and the underwear. But you know what it's like to wait for something, and not just, okay, I'm going to have to wait in line at the BMV, but I mean you're really waiting, expecting, and hoping. You know that feeling? Maybe you've been waiting to hear good news from the doctor, and until that day comes, you're just hanging, waiting. It seems like you can't breathe in between till that happens. Maybe you had a gift one time at Christmas that you just thought, I can't wait. I can remember, it seems year after year when I was young, there were gifts that would come at Christmas. I was like, oh, please, it's got to be there. I can't wait till Christmas morning. Maybe you wait for something to be resolved. Maybe there's conflict, and you just hang on it. This is going to get fixed. It's going to get resolved. But you know what it's like to wait, right? And you know how that feels. The period between when the expectation is set and when it is finally met, that period of waiting, sometimes it can be fun. But let's be honest, sometimes it can be stressful. If it's a long period of waiting, sometimes it can just fray you. Sometimes it can feel like the rest of life collapses around you in a period of waiting and waiting. And again, in line at BMV or to get your vehicle repaired is one thing, but when you're really hoping and just hanging onto something that you're waiting for, that time, it can really add up. And you start to wonder, I think the question, when you really, really are trying to be patient, and it's hard because you're waiting for something you hope for so dearly, the question that can form in our minds is this going to happen? Am I waiting for a false hope? Am I waiting for something that's not reality? Am I waiting for something it's just never going to happen? Sometimes as we wait, that question can form in our minds. Will this happen? And for you and I know scenarios in our lives, it can feel like the waiting is just intense, but I want you to think about this. What if you had something that you were waiting on and people had been waiting for generations? So what if it wasn't just a week or a month or a year? What if it were 40 years, 100 years? I mean, hey, you give up because, well, face it, most of us don't live to be 100. But really, what if there was generational waiting? I think, for instance, of, well, Cubs fans until last year. There's always next year we're going to get one, but the reality was the Cubs just couldn't get it done. Imagine how those poor schlups felt. I'm not going to take any cracks about the Vikings at this time. Thank you. Seriously, imagine, for instance, how the African Americans must have felt from the time they arrived here as slaves until the time Martin Luther King Jr. said, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. That's a generational waiting. Imagine how that must have felt. Imagine the people currently living where there's so much war, so many war-torn areas in the Middle Eastern regions. Imagine the average family that's not involved, but all around them is destruction. All around them is uncertainty. And we hear that someday there will bring peace, or maybe this war will end, or maybe the strivings will cease, or there will be, a political action or a military action. But in the meantime, every day is uncertainty. And it's not just been that way this year, or last year, or 5 years. They have lived in the midst of that chaos. Imagine any of those scenarios. Imagine how it feels to wait, and to expect, and how thin you can feel stretched. And the question again arises, will this happen? For Israel, for God's people, they had been waiting, longing, hoping for the redemption of Israel, that their land would be restored, that their people would be restored, and it had been 450 years. Now, different scholars pick a different timeline. Some say 500, some say 350. Okay, let's go with 450. 450 years. Be sure and ask your children, especially the younger ones, if they'd like to wait 450 years for the next Christmas gift. See how that goes. Think of that thing that you said, yeah, I know what it's like to wait, or that you were imagining you had to wait for. And again, apply 450 years to it. Israel had been waiting since the last prophet had spoken, since any word was given, since any hope was extended to them, a sign, anything. 450 years. 450 years between the last book in the Old Testament was recorded and the New Testament, sometime around Jesus' life, was written. 450 years of expectations. And God's going to come through for us. See, in that 450 years, what had happened was there were several kind of Greek empires that had taken control. The Ptolemies, they had conquered them. And then another span, a different faction of what was once a mighty army came in. The Seleucids, they took over and they forced the Israelites into their religious practices. There was no choice. This is what was happening. You were to worship in this way, and that's where we get a lot of the mythology. Those were enforced. And so whether they believed in the God of Israel or anything else, the Seleucids came in and forced religious practices. The Israelites, they'd been exiled from their land already, and they were to face a second exile where they were kicked out entirely. They had foreign rule set up, and just to keep that in your head, what that would feel like, imagine that somebody comes in to the United States, takes over, and says, here are the laws you're going to live by. We don't care what you think anymore. This is not a democracy. And everywhere you go, somebody from that ruling party is there watching, making sure you follow their rules, you worship in their way, and you live where they choose, and you do what they say. This was the position Israel was in. And yet they had this promise they were holding on to, that God was working to send them a deliverer. No, generation would tell the next generation, our God is great. And they live in captivity, basically. No, this will end. The Ptolemies will not reign forever. And then the Seleucids come in, and they're one group worse. No, we will be free. God is at work. And the Romans take over, the most powerful empire the world had seen at that time. And they enforce their rule. And yet they continue to say, children, our God is faithful. Tell your children, our God is going to come through. Don't give up. Our God he is stronger. And for 450 years, nothing. How would that feel for waiting? Can you fathom? Can you imagine? Can you just for a moment raise your hand if you would be tempted to give up and say, God did not come through? I'm just being honest. That would be very difficult. That type of waiting, that type of expecting, that type of longing is what Israel faced when we come to the passage that I have for you this morning. From the Gospel of Luke, there was a man in Jerusalem called Simeon who was righteous and devout. He was waiting for the consolation of Israel. And I want you to hear that phrase because it does not say he was waiting for Jesus Christ. He didn't know who Jesus Christ was. It does not say he was waiting for God to claim him and take him to heaven because there was something he had been waiting longer for. He had probably heard the stories of. He had been told the promises of. He was waiting for the consolation or the redemption of Israel, God's people. And it had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not die before he had seen the Lord's Messiah. So moved by the Spirit, he went to the temple courts. And when the parents brought the child Jesus to do for him what the law required, Simeon took him in his arms and praised God, saying, Sovereign Lord, as you have promised. Simeon was old, and I don't know exactly how old, but he had lived his life in the temple. He was righteous and devout. He had heard these promises, and they had to have come from generations past, and lives most of his life and does not see this. But yet he knows somehow, he has a sense, he has a vision, he has a promise from the Spirit. Somehow he is assured that in his lifetime he will see Israel's deliverer. And he lives again most of his life, and this doesn't happen. But Mary and Joseph walk into the temple to fulfill the requirements of the law, and they bring Jesus. And his words as he embraces this child, Sovereign Lord, as you have promised. Not, God, it's about time. Do you know how long it has been? I stopped praying 50 years ago, God. What were you doing? He did not say, Sovereign Lord, I hope this goes somewhere. He did not list out all the problems again that they faced. But the word was given to him somehow he would see the Messiah. And when Jesus is brought, all of the things he was waiting for were confirmed in an instant. Everything that he had waited for, and his parents and his grandparents and generations before that had waited for, showed up and was in his arms. And his words, God, Sovereign Lord, as you have promised, more or less, I knew you'd come through. That's the expression, as you have promised. And then he goes on to say, you may now dismiss your servant in peace. Diana thought she was clever this week and asked why I wasn't going to dwell on that verse. The promise of God, and then you just let your life go. Doesn't seem really Advent or Christmassy to me. But Sovereign Lord, he says, as you have promised, you may now dismiss your servant in peace. My eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the sight of all nations, a light for revelation to the Gentiles and the glory of your people Israel. Sovereign Lord, as you have promised. The child's father and mother, well, they marveled about what was said to them. Simeon blessed them and said to Mary, this child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many in Israel. This child is destined to be a sign that will be spoken against. So the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed, and a sword will pierce your own soul too. Simeon knew it wasn't all finished, but that God was good on his promises. There was also a prophet, Anna, the daughter of Penuel, of the tribe of Asher. She was very old. It says that. I'm not adding that. Again, an exact age, meh. But this prophet, Anna, was very old and had lived with her husband 7 years after her marriage. and then was a widow until she was 84. And she never left the temple, but worshiped day and night, fasting and praying. Coming up to them at that moment, she gave thanks to God and spoke about the child to all who were looking forward to the redemption of Israel. And again, what she looked forward to, what this prophet Anna, very similar to Simeon, what she looked forward to was the redemption of God's people. Because I want you to hear, it's not a specific promise to her. This is an individual thing that she has wanted. It's not something that maybe she's been tinkering with since her husband had passed away, that, well, maybe if I hang around the temple, I'll get word from God. This was a generational promise. This was a long time coming. This was something she and every one of God's people had been waiting for, yearning for, longing for, probably feeling this may not be happening. But there she was in the temple, and there again come Mary and Joseph, and they bring the baby Jesus, and she spoke about this child to all who were looking forward to the redemption of Israel. Again, at that moment, she knew. She didn't speak to those who were excited because there was a new baby born, and so we need to celebrate that. She didn't speak to those who thought, maybe this will be a great worker for the temple, so let's see if we can talk to his parents and get him to have a life of service to the temple. She spoke to all who were looking forward to the redemption of Israel. She spoke to everyone that was in the same state of waiting she was. And what Simeon saw in this passage and what Anna found in this passage was that God can be trusted. Though they'd heard stories and they'd waited, and they themselves were even old, at least 84 for Anna, but possibly older than that. Though all of their lives they'd been clinging to something that others had certainly given up on and said, just walk away. This is foolishness. It's not going to happen. They held on to that, and in this moment they found, as they saw face to face God's deliverer, the Messiah, they found God can be trusted. God's promises are true. They hadn't believed in vain. There was indeed hope. God's promises are true. N.T. Wright has an interesting book. And what he says in that book is Christianity is not, and he gives a list of some of the things that we make Christianity out to be, some of the things that we say we hope for. And he says it's not simply these things. Christianity is not about Jesus as a wonderful moral example. Well, certainly he was. Jesus absolutely taught us a bit about how we can live and how we can act and how we can love. But that was not the point of it all. N.T. Wright says Christianity is not about getting to heaven when you die. Now, that is definitely a benefit included with the Gold Club card. But there's more to it than that, because there's a lot that happens in this life that affects what happens then. And God's reality can set on people in this life, and we have work to do in this life. It's more than just heaven someday. N.T. Wright says Christianity is not about teaching us more clearly about God. God's work in Jesus wasn't just so that we could have an intellectual understanding of God and see that more clearly. Though we do know a lot more about God through Jesus' life, that's not the main point. There's a surprising number of people that know a fair deal about God, intellectual knowledge, yet they reject God. That in itself is not the point. But what is the point? N.T. Wright says Christianity is all about the belief that the living God, in fulfillment of His promises, and as the climax of the story of God's people, has accomplished everything. The finding, the saving, the giving of new life. He has done it all in Jesus. Christianity is about living into the reality that God can be trusted. God has fulfilled His promises, and in Jesus, all of that has been done. We sing about this sometimes. We have different songs, and maybe you can help me. I've left some blanks. See if you can fill them in. There is no rock, there is no God like our God. No other name by which we can be saved, the rock of salvation that cannot be moved. He's proven himself to be faithful and true. We sing about that. Those are lyrics when you come and you gather with us Sunday. Every now and then the praise band pulls that one up and we sing it. We've got some other songs. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, your hand has provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Sometimes we sing that one. It's found in our hymnal. It's one that a lot of people know. Great is thy faithfulness. Or how about standing on the blank of God my Savior. Standing on the what? Standing on the promises. We sing those things. In a time of song, in a time of praise, we declare those, but my question is, do we feel them and do we know them in our heart? Do we sing those in vain, or do we believe in a God that can be trusted? Do we believe in a God whose promises are true? Sometimes I'd propose we might feel more like this one. Maybe this is a song you're not familiar with, but listen to the lyrics. Give me faith to trust what you say, that you're good and your love is great. I'm broken inside. I give you my life. I may be weak, but your Spirit's strong in me. My flesh may fail, but God, you never will. Whoever wrote that song expressing that, God, I believe you are true, yet in the meantime I am broken and I cannot make it. Sometimes I think that is the song that we most identify with. We wrestle with things when we wait for an answer. Again, we get stressed. We start to doubt. We've been waiting sometimes for 1 month, for whatever it is in our life, or maybe a week, and it seems like too much and too long, and God, what are you doing? Sometimes the tensions that we feel, sometimes the waiting, sometimes the yearning for God to do something, it can feel lengthened, it can feel amplified during the holidays. Maybe you had something that you thought was yours and you were counting on it and you were saying, yay, I can't wait. And all of a sudden it slipped away. And you thought you had that and it's gone. And you can say, God, but I waited and I trusted in what happened. Maybe you were waiting for good news and it never came. You were hoping to hear, you were expecting to get, and you never got that, or worse yet, maybe you got bad news. Maybe the diagnosis that you were hoping for turned out differently. Maybe word about a loved one ended differently than you were expecting. Maybe at the holidays, you just feel exasperated by the loss of a loved one that you've experienced. This time, where it should be so much joy, it seems only to stir up memories and pain, and you have a difficult time saying, God is still working. Maybe you look at the news, you look at the situation in the world, and you hear about the stories that are on the internet and what's happening in other nations and some parts of our nation. And maybe in that way, you associate with the Israelites. It just doesn't seem like it's ever going to end. And we believe that one day God will return, but I'm starting to think maybe not. Maybe you feel very similar to what the Israelites felt. Maybe you say the world just can't be righted at this point. Somewhere in your life, there's an expectation, there's a waiting, there's a sense of longing. And I think all of us do it where we say, God, are you still there? God, do you know what's happening? God, are you still at work? Are you alive? But one of the Proverbs, one of the oldest writings in the Old Testament, wrote, trust in the Lord and He will make your path straight. Jeremiah, one of the prophets, wrote, I know the plans you have for me, plans to prosper and not to harm me. Isaiah recorded God saying, do not fear, I am with you. Do not be dismayed, I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. And the psalmist even declared, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you are with me. All of those recorded in our Old Testament of Scripture. All of those promises that the various authors were clinging to, expressing through their writing. But were they true? I mean, can God really be counted on? I wish we could ask Simeon and Anna. I wish we could go back and find these people late in their life, waiting so long for the promise, and just see what they would say to us in that moment where they held the Christ child. In that moment where before maybe they drew some of their last breaths or lived out their last days, they saw God can be trusted. God's promises are real because this child is what the world was waiting for. So as we come to Christmas, we're in the Advent season, the season leading up to. So my question for you is, where do you need that reminder? Because on Christmas Day, there's a lot of celebration that happens, and it may be because of the toys and the gifts, and it might be because of the socks and underwear, but it should certainly be because we remember, as God's people, God can be trusted. God's promises are true. There's a story of Henry Ford one time who had some very important people, some business investors touring his plant. And this was when Ford wasn't just one of a billion car companies. Ford was the car company. Everything that you'd want to see, that you'd want to learn from, that you'd want to find was happening at Ford at this time. Henry Ford was giving a tour, and the people were going from office to office, from place to place in the facility. And they came to an office where one engineer should have had his office, but he was kind of in the corner with his feet kicked up on his desk, looking up at the ceiling. And the business people, they stopped and they said right there, "What is going on? I mean, what is this? You're doing a tremendous thing. You are running this car company. You're doing, new things. What is happening with this guy, and why do you keep him around?" And Henry Ford stopped and said, "I don't question that at all. That is my top engineer. He's come up with some of our best designs. And if he feels it necessary to kick up his feet on his desk and sit in the corner like that, I trust him." Sometimes it can seem like God's doing that. From our perspective, sometimes we wonder, does God have his feet kicked up on the desk? Is God looking at the ceiling? Has God forgotten that we're experiencing life on this earth? But I think we need to take that attitude of it doesn't matter what God is doing right now, because in the end, I know that God is faithful and his promises can be trusted.